Your belly fat has more fat releasing receptors than any other fat in your body. So then maybe the obvious question in your mind is, why won't it go away? Why does it feel like the most stubborn thing on your body? The answer isn't that the fat isn't moving. The answer is that you are measuring it with the wrong instrument. The scale tracks total body weight, and the visceral fat, the fat packed deep inside your abdominal cavity around your organs, doesn't move the scale much when it drops. What it moves instead is your waste, your labs, your fasting insulin, your energy after meals. The scale stays quiet while visceral fat is already leaving. And that mismatch, stable weight but a shrinking waist, is the first signal that something is actually working. I stopped trusting the scale as primary signals years ago because the pattern I kept seeing in practice didn't match what the scale was saying. Patient doing everything right, time restricted, working consistently, resistance training, no alcohol. They would come back frustrated because the number on scale had not moved much. And then I'd measure the waist, down 4, 5, sometimes 6 centimeters. Lab shifting, fasting insulin lower, belt notch moved. Scale said nothing happened. The body said something completely different. So, before anything else, put the scale down, or at least stop letting it be the judge. Because with the visceral fat, it will lie to you consistently. Now, let's talk about what visceral fat actually is. Because most people don't know this. Visceral fat is not the same as the fat you can pinch. The fat you can pinch is subcutaneous. It sits under the skin. It's relatively inert and it's genuinely stubborn. Visceral fat sits deeper. It wraps around your liver, your pancreas, your intestines. And because it sits directly on those organs, it behaves entirely different. Unlike subcutaneous fat, it is metabolically active. It behaves less like a storage and more like an organ itself because it acts like an organ. It produces inflammatory signals. It communicates these signals directly with your liver through the portal vein, using it as an unfiltered anatomical highway. And when it accumulates, it starts running a process that makes everything else harder. It worsens insulin resistance. It drives chronic low grade inflammation and it disrupts the hormonal signals that should be telling your body to burn fuel instead of store it. This is why visceral fat is dangerous in a way that the fat on your hips simply isn't. And it's also why reducing it changes your labs, your energy, and your disease risk, not just your waistline. Before 60, your body maintained a natural defense system against this accumulation. Two hormones were quietly managing your body fat geography: estrogen in women and testosterone in men. Both of them, among everything else they do, were acting as architectural signal. Estrogen told your body to store fat peripherally, hips, thighs, under the skin. Testosterone supported lipolysis, favored muscles our fat storage, and kept the abdominal compartment from becoming the body's preferred deposit site. Not by blocking visceral storage directly, but by maintaining the muscles to fat signaling environment that made visceral fat accumulation less likely. When that signal weakens, the abdominal compartment stops being defended. These were the instructions your body ran on for decades. Then those defensive signals decline. Testosterone in men drops roughly 1 to 2% per year. By 60, that cumulative decline is significant. In women, estrogen falls sharply through menopause. As those signals weakens, the entire fat geography changes. Fat that previously lived in peripheral storage loses its boundary and start redistributing inward into the visceral compartments around the organs, and the waist still grows. This is why the scale can hold steady and the waist still grows. This is why the hips get thinner while the belly gets denser. The total body isn't dramatically increasing, the address is changing, and that redistribution process runs continuously in background, which means you can be doing everything right and still watch the West expand because the migration is ongoing, even as the scale cooperates. I see this consistently. Patient who looks fine by BMI, weight stable, sometimes even lower than 5 years ago, but the West is larger. The labs are worse. And when I ask about their hips, their face, their arms, they are all thinner. Same fat, new location. So, what actually stops migration and unlocks those fat releasing receptors that are already there? The answer is insulin. And this is the central mechanism that connects those receptors directly to your habits. Insulin is your body primary storage signal. When insulin is elevated, the mobilization door for fat, especially visceral fat, stays closed. You can't release fat from storage while insulin is telling your body to store. These two signals directly oppose each other. And visceral fat, with its dense receptor population, is sensitive to this opposition. High insulin means the door stays locked, regardless of what else you are doing. Low insulin means the door opens, and visceral fat, because of those receptors' advantages, comes out first. This absolute requirements for low insulin is the mechanism behind the time restricted eating. Calorie reduction plays a role. It always does. But the research shows that time restricted eating produces metabolic improvement that go beyond what the calorie math alone explains. Lower fasting insulin improved insulin sensitivity, reduced visceral fat even in condition where caloric intake is held constant. The eating window, it's about creating a sustained daily period where insulin drops low enough that the mobilization door can actually open. That low insulin window is when the release happens, not during exercise specifically, during the window. A 12-hour fast to start. Finish eating by 7 in the evening. Don't eat again until the 7 the next morning. That alone creates a mobilization window that most people who only fast for 8 or 10 hours a day never get. And this is why the belt notch moves before the scale does. The visceral fat releasing into the bloodstream. And with insulin low, the condition for burning that fuel instead of restoring it are finally in place. But the total body weight impact is modest. Visceral fat is dense, but it doesn't represent massive scale weight. What it represents is organ function, inflammatory load, and waist circumference. Those changes, the scale barely registered it. Now, the second input, and this is one is about partially replacing that missing redistribution signal itself, not just the mobilization. Resistance training. I want to be the specific about the mechanism because the most people get this wrong. They think it matters for calorie burn. That is not the primary driver here. What resistance training does after 60 is partially restore the architectural signal that testosterone was providing. Research published in Diabetes Care confirmed visceral fat reduction in older adults after progressive resistance training, even when total body weight and total fat mass barely changed. The mechanism is metabolic and hormonal, but not in the way most people assume. Compound movement, squats, rows, presses, movements that recreates large amounts of muscle mass do generates an acute growth hormone response even in older adults. And growth hormone is direct lipolytic signals targeting that deep compartment. Beyond that, resistance training improves insulin sensitivity and the cellular machinery for glucose uptake in muscle tissue. Together, those changes shifts the metabolic environment in the abdominal compartment. You are not burning the fat off during this session. You are changing the hormonal metabolic condition that determine where the body stores and release fat. And visceral compartment is first to respond to that shift. The third input is deep sleep. And this is the variable I see most consistently underestimated and most consistently missing in patients whose waist isn't responding despite doing the other things right. Because growth hormone is one of the body's primary overnight signal for the fat mobilization and lipolysis broadly. And its relevance to the visceral compartment is direct. Growth hormone deficient states consistently and specifically produce visceral fat accumulation, not peripheral fat accumulation. That precise pattern tells you exactly where growth hormones metabolic protection is concentrated. When slow wave sleep is fragmented, which happens increasingly after 60, that growth hormone release window closed entirely. The exercise you did, the eating window you maintained, the discipline of the day, none of it fully reaches the visceral compartment if that overnight release window isn't open. Screen off 90 minutes before sleep. Consistent sleep and wake time, including weekends. Dark room, cool temperature, these protects the growth hormone pulse that visceral fat responds to directly. This is not a comfort suggestion. This is the mechanical process by which visceral fat physically exits the call overnight. And a patient whose waist is moving despite everything else being corrected. This is the variable that almost always explain it. Now the timeline. And I want to be honest about this because unrealistic expectations causes people to quit. Exactly when the physiology is starting to deliver. Weeks 1 and 2. Insulin starts dropping. The mobilization window opens. You won't see dramatic changes. What you will notice instead is hunger becoming more stable, energy after meals more consistent, afternoon cravings quieting. That is insulin sensitivity begins to restore. That is the mechanism engaging. Week 3 through 6. The waist measurement starts shifting 1 centimeters, maybe 2. The scale may show nothing because your body is simultaneously holding or building dense muscle tissue. Measure the waist, not the narrowest point at the navel. That number is honest signal. Weeks 8 through 12, lab shift, fasting insulin measurably lower, fasting glucose more stable, and something else starts happening. The inflammatory signals visceral fat was producing starts quieting as the depot shrinks. Less inflammation means better insulin sensitivity. Better insulin sensitivity means more efficient mobilization. The loop that was accelerated the problem starts running in reverse. And here is what that actually feels like before the mirror confirms it. Sleep gets deeper. Energy is more stable through the afternoon. joint inflammation, which visceral fat active rise through its inflammatory output, often quite noticeably. Patients report feeling better weeks before they see it. The most likely explains is the one of the biology points to visceral fat is a pro-inflammatory organs. And as its mass decreases, the inflammatory cytokinase it was pumping into the system starts pulling back. Whether that's the full explanation is still being studied, but the pattern is consistent enough that it's not something to dismiss. The scale is still saying almost nothing. Measure the best. Watch the energy. Notice the sleep. Because visceral fat leaves through those signals first and loudly before it ever shows up clearly in the mirror or on the scale. You have been chasing the wrong metric. And that mismatch, you have been frustrated by stable weight, clothes fitting differently, waist slowly changing, while the number refuses to cooperate. That mismatch is not failure. That is visceral fat, doing exactly what the biology says it does, leaving first quietly before anything else admits it.